Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're really pleased to have you here with us today for a talk with David Biale and Sarah Abrevaya Stein about David's new book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. It's a wonderful book and it's available on YIVO's shop. So we hope you'll check it out, inspired by today's talk. Before I hand it over, I just want to say a very brief word about YIVO. YIVO is a very special place for the celebration and contemplation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have an archive and a library with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which are used by researchers around the world. We seek to make the collections, the history that they represent, the culture that they represent, available to a broad public through exhibitions, through education, a variety of classes, including Yiddish language instruction, and public programs like this. So if you're new to YIVO, hope you'll join us again. Check out all of our past programs on our YouTube channel. We're really pleased to have David Biale and Sarah Abrevaya Stein here with us to discuss this wonderful new book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy. David Biale is Emanuel Ringelblum Distinguished Professor of Jewish History at the University of California, Davis. He was educated at UC Berkeley, the Hebrew University, and UCLA, and his books include Hasidism, A New History, along with a bunch of co-authors, Gershom Scholem, Master of the Kabbalah, Not in the Heavens, The Tradition of Jewish Secular Thought, Gershom Scholem, Kabbalah and Counterhistory, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, Eros and the Jews, Blood and Belief, The Circulation of a Symbol Between Jews and Christians. And he's also the editor of Culture of the Jews, A New History, Norton Anthology of World Religions, Judaism. I tell you all these books just so you know, David Biale is a giant of the field, and we're so honored to be able to talk about his new book today. Sarah Abrevaya Stein is author or editor of 10 books. In the New York Times, Mati Friedman has written that Stein, a UCLA historian, has ferocious research talents and a writing voice that is admirably light and human. Stein's most recent book, Wartime North Africa, A Documentary History 1934 to 1950, is the first ever collection of primary documents on North African history and the Holocaust. Stein's books and articles and pedagogy have won numerous prizes, including 2 National Jewish Book Awards, the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award. And Stein is also the co-editor with David Biale of Stanford University Press's series in Jewish History and Culture. So really just absolutely delighted to have these 2 distinguished folks joining us today. Without further ado, I hand it over to them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Julia and Jonah, for facilitating this. And it's just a pleasure, David, to be with you, a longtime colleague, friend, mentor, inspiration. I'm delighted to be speaking with you about your new and wonderful book and really how to understand it in the context of your career, and perhaps particularly the intellectual moment in which you find yourself now. I want to say that because you are a graduate of UCLA, I'm really pleased to be representing UCLA here, and the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA is a co-sponsor of the event, and it's wonderful to work with YIVO, which is the place where, in fact, I cut my archival teeth. So great to all gather here today. So, David, congratulations on the book. It's wonderful. And I have myriad questions, some of which I have shared with you beforehand and some of which I couldn't resist adding at the end. But I thought it was appropriate to begin by inviting you to talk to us about the genealogy of the notion of counterhistory, beginning with Gershom Scholem and explaining what this concept means to you in this book, and perhaps to have you read from the first pages of the book, in which you very directly and tersely describe this analytic as a point of inspiration.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So first of all, I want to thank YIVO for putting this on. I've also had some wonderful residencies at YIVO, which is one of the most congenial places I've ever worked. And so it seems very appropriate that we're doing this here. Yeah, so the concept of counterhistory is one that I developed in my first book, which was actually my PhD dissertation on Gershom Scholem. And I was initially interested not just in Scholem, but in what I called radical Jewish philosophies of history, in which people like Michael Yosef Berdichevsky, someone I wrote my senior honors thesis on at UC Berkeley, look for sources of vitality in Jewish history, not in the mainstream conventional Orthodox tradition, but instead in various marginal, countercultural, even heretical voices. And Scholem was supposed to be the last chapter in that dissertation. Just a little anecdote of the great Israeli historian Jacob Katz was visiting at UCLA, and I took a seminar with him. And I ran my idea for dissertation with Katz, and I saw he wasn't interested. So I went back to Amos Funkenstein, who was my advisor, and I'm sure we'll end up talking about him quite a bit. I said, look, Katz is not interested. So Funkenstein said, well, why don't you take your last chapter on Scholem and turn it into the centerpiece? And you can talk about all these other figures who are a lot less known than Scholem. I went back to Katz and said, what would you think about the dissertation on Scholem? And he said, no one in Jerusalem would dare to write it, but they will all read it. And he then paved the way for me to meet Professor Scholem several times, interview him, and sort of set me on my way. So, yeah, so Scholem, already as an undergraduate, when I read Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, I was so excited to see this approach that is to find the sources of vitality precisely in those things that have been discarded or deprecated. Heinrich Gretz, for example, famously said that the Kabbalah was un-Jewish, that it was a kind of a pestilential growth on the kernel of what is truly Jewish. And Scholem found precisely there the most exciting tradition. And so I was already very excited by this idea as an undergraduate. And then writing about him for my dissertation, I began to develop the idea of counterhistory. I have to give credit to my teacher, Amos Funkenstein, who already used this term. I ended up expanding on it in very different ways, which I'm sure we can talk about as well. So I have to give him credit for the term itself, but the way I applied it became my own. And it started really with that dissertation on Scholem, and it sort of accompanied me throughout the years as something I've applied from time to time. I can read very briefly from the first pages here, and I start out by referring to Scholem's famous essay on the history of Jewish studies, called in Hebrew Hirhurim al Chochmat Israel. And he described how his study of Jewish mysticism aimed at overturning the rationalism of his 19th century predecessors. He quoted a wonderful verse from Psalm 122, "The stone the builders developed has become the capstone." This was Scholem's method, which I described as counterhistory, that is the discovery of vital forces precisely in what others have considered marginal, disreputable, and irrational, those that occupy, in his words, the fine line between religion and nihilism. And I defined there several aspects of counterhistory. One is the denial that Jewish history or Judaism has an essence, that is, has one idea or set of ideas which are canonical, and that we are done defining our subject when we define those ideas. Instead, we find a kind of dialectic between these canonical ideas and those that resist them, that overturn them, that are maybe even heretical. So that's an important argument in my work against the idea of this is again a term that goes back to the 19th century, Wesen des Judentums, essence of Judaism. No, there is no essence. Instead, there are these various forces dialectically working against each other to produce something much more interesting and complex. And finally, Judaism cannot be reduced just to a religion. Judaism is, in fact, and here I make use of the concept of culture as a much bigger tent that encompasses religion, but all kinds of other forces, popular voices, the voices of women, etc., that constitute a much broader concept of our subject. And that also is something that has accompanied my work throughout, especially the book that I edited called Cultures of the Jews. And so I've deployed the term Jewish culture in this book in the title, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. And there's so much in that answer that I want to return to and pick apart together. But perhaps a fruitful beginning point is to think of the words of caution that you received, that no one would write that project in Jerusalem, but you could write it in California, because it seems to me impossible to think about your notion of counterhistory without acknowledging, as you do in this book, and especially in a very moving autobiographical essay that concludes the volume, without acknowledging the importance of California as an intellectual nursery for you. And you write here in this essay about, well, you imply essentially how your notions of counterhistory emerge greatly out of your engagement with counterculture in Berkeley, in California, in the 60s, in dialogue with Israel, which I'd like to come back to later. But could you speak about that source of inspiration of counterculture, and also perhaps what the environment of California as a student, and then later through many decades as a teacher and a scholar, how that provided a very particular form of incubation for your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that as an historian, I mean, I belong to, I guess one could call it the second generation of Jewish studies in North America, a very small group of people at the seminaries and a handful of universities founded the Association for Jewish Studies in the 1960s. I think you could put all of them into a small room. And then their students, and I count myself as one of them, were those who really built the field, went out to many different universities, established programs. So I belong to that generation. But my road to the field of Jewish studies was perhaps not a conventional one. That is, I did not grow up in a traditional household. I grew up in a secular Zionist family, especially my father. We did not belong to a synagogue. And I became fascinated with Judaism, Jewish history, really as part of the counterculture of the late 60s and early 70s. When I was a student at Berkeley, I joined a group called the Radical Jewish Union, a group that, by the way, is still very much in touch. We have a kind of group listserv. We're still in touch. About a dozen of these people are living in Israel now. We had a reunion there last month. This group was really, it was a rather heterogeneous group in terms of where people came from, but we really defined ourselves against the American Jewish establishment, both religious and political. We were a kind of a socialist Zionist group, I guess you could call us, with a range of opinions. And so for me, this was my sort of extracurricular activity when I was a student, and I had become, I majored in history. I was interested in intellectual history. And at a certain point, the light bulb kind of went on, and I realized that I could combine my extracurricular commitments with my academic interests. And so I made the switch to Jewish history while still an undergraduate at Berkeley. You couldn't really study Jewish history at Berkeley in those days. So we basically carved out, myself and my comrades, we carved out a kind of a alternative Jewish studies program of our own, which we taught ourselves. We read essays like Chaim Nachman Bialik's famous essay, Concealment and Revelation in Language. And we broke our teeth reading that Hebrew. And so we basically kind of trained ourselves, and that's how I ended up writing a senior honors thesis on this radical character, Berdichevsky. So it really grew out of the counterculture of the period. And so when I came to study at UCLA with Amos Funkenstein, I found there a kind of kindred spirit. That is, his path also to the field of Jewish studies was not a conventional one at all. He was Israeli. He did a few courses at the Hebrew University, but then he went to Berlin. He was the first Israeli to get a PhD in Germany after the war. And he didn't focus on Jewish studies. Basically, he took what he knew from his religious high school training and taught himself the field. And so when I came to study with him, it was like a completely fresh voice. This wasn't the conventional seminary kind of approach. It was something entirely different, and for me, much more exciting.
That's wonderful. And I'd like to follow up with a series of questions about working with Amos Funkenstein and his intellectual imprint upon you. You dedicate this book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, to Amos Funkenstein. And I read before this event, I reread a beautiful obituary that you wrote for him in Tablet magazine. And I'm just going to read 2 sentences from that, 3 sentences. You wrote, like Spinoza, whose philosophy played a central role in his work, Amos was a true Epicurus, a heretic from within his tradition. The term Epicurus is evidently derived from Epicurean in the Greek, originally signified in the rabbinic idiom a Jew who, like the Epicurean philosophers, did not believe that the gods intervened in the affairs of this world. On one level, this was certainly Amos's position, but in popular parlance, the Epicurus signifies much more broadly the rebellion against Orthodox Jewish belief and practice, whose rebellion is grounded in the classical sources themselves. It is in this latter sense that one thinks of Amos, the heretic who knew the Jewish tradition better than most who call themselves Orthodox. When I read your book, when I sit back and meditate on the disparate essays that make up this volume, whose contents address seemingly very disparate themes, David, and span a career, so took shape over different chapters of your intellectual life and your personal life. The theme that really emerges is the embrace of the counter-canonical. So I would love you to speak a little bit more about that idea and about how working with Professor Funkenstein expanded your approach to Jewish studies. And I'm heaping questions upon you, but the other question that strikes me as germane is to ask you to reflect on the kind of broad training that you received with Dr. Funkenstein, which has become an anomaly, I think it's fair to say, in the present day, a kind of scholarly training that extended not only from antiquity to the present, but through all the myriad texts that Jews read and wrote and about which were written. So this broad approach that he crafted, or that you crafted in dialogue, and I would be remiss to not say that also your wife Rachel Biale was learning with him, and together you were crafting these approaches in dialogue. But it seems so foundational to your work, and especially to the books such as Blood and Belief, Eros and the Jews, Power and Powerlessness, that cross boundaries feverishly. And I think that really honor the description of your writing that you offered at the beginning of elevating concepts otherwise neglected and tracing these complex genealogies through the richness of Jewish culture temporally and textually. So that is a lot to offer you, but I wonder if we could go back to UCLA, to Amos Funkenstein, and talk about how all of this took shape.
Yeah, so wonderful questions. I hope I can address at least some of them. So when I arrived at UCLA as a doctoral student, my background had been studying modern Jewish history and thought. I didn't know a great deal about earlier periods in Jewish history. And I discovered that what Funkenstein was teaching was a seminar on medieval Jewish biblical exegesis. So I had no choice. That's what he was teaching. So I enrolled in the seminar, and all of a sudden a world opened up to me that I didn't know existed of medieval Jewish thinkers who themselves, maybe they were not heretical after all. Abraham Ibn Ezra, who was sort of the central focus of our course, is a canonical interpreter of the Bible, and yet what you find in there is some very, very radical ideas about the fact that the Bible wasn't all written by Moses. It doesn't contain all knowledge. So this is just a revelation to me. And my seminar paper for that first quarter at UCLA was about Ibn Ezra's philosophy of exegesis. When I go back and look at that now, and that is in this book, I'm kind of amazed at how quickly I learned a great deal about medieval Jewish thought in 10 weeks of that course. But that's sort of the learning curve that Funkenstein encouraged. That is, he believed that if you had adequate training, you could take on any subject in the field and learn it. And so he encouraged us to be very broad. The doctoral comprehensive examinations, I had to be prepared to answer questions from the Bible, the rabbinic period. In fact, what he did is he presented me with a text about how the rabbis deposed Rabban Gamliel from the office of Nasi, and I had to read that text and interpret it in the exams, and my training wasn't precisely in rabbinic. So that's the kind of very, very broad education that he gave us, which to me was enormously exciting. Funkenstein definitely, kind of imbibing an old Germanic approach to history, Geistesgeschichte, that is the tracing of ideas, the genealogy of ideas, sort of out of favor now, but that's kind of what we learned. I'll tell a very quick anecdote. When Funkenstein came to UC Berkeley, he was in Berkeley for the last 5 years of his life, and there were graduate students who heard he was coming, and they said, went to him and said, could we do a seminar on Nicholas of Cusa? Funkenstein said, yes, of course, we will meet every week. And in the first meeting, he said, in order to understand Nicholas of Cusa, you have to understand Aristotle. So they began to read Aristotle. They met for 5 years every week. They never got to Nicholas of Cusa because the whole idea was this incredible, rich library of books and sources that one engaged with. I mean, one became part of that intellectual discourse when you studied with him. So that really laid the groundwork for something that I ended up doing, not really intentionally at first, and that is taking on subjects and tracing their genealogy from the Bible into the modern period. And I did that with my second book, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, with my third book, Eros and the Jews, and then later on with my fourth book, Blood and Belief. So this was a kind of a method that was, I think I may be one of the very few people who's tried this method. At a certain point, I said, you're crazy. You should become a specialist in one area of Jewish history. But the training with Funkenstein always forced me back to these big questions and these long genealogies. And that's something that I really owe to him. And there were a variety of ideas that he came up with that I actually ended up expanding on. So he wrote an essay called The Myth of the Passivity of Diaspora Jews. That essay was kind of the nugget that became, or the seed that became my book, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History. He also wrote an essay on counter history where he looked actually at anti-Semitic histories of the Jews that inverted the Jews were not a people that escaped from Egypt, but instead a leper people who was expelled. These kind of counter histories were something that interested him, and I took that concept and built on it. So he was absolutely formative. The experience of studying with him is something I've never encountered since. We would walk by his office to say hello. He would motion to us to come in and say, let's study a text. And that's what we did. And it was just a mind-expanding experience those years at UCLA.
It's so interesting because it seems to me this is not only the product of broad thinking or perhaps in your case of broad training, but it also instilled in you a kind of fearlessness, an intellectual fearlessness. And all of those are components that are arguably harder to attain now for junior scholars or scholars in training, notwithstanding the fact that they are writing wonderful work. But it does seem, in the current moment, it seems born of an optimism of the moment of the 60s that you describe, that today feels perhaps a little distant from the way we teach and the way our students learn.
Yeah, I think that,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, do you wish to respond? I was going to, or I'll transition us to a new topic.
Well, yeah, just very quickly, I think that you're absolutely right. And I think the fact that this was a kind of a distant outpost of Jewish studies at UCLA made it possible. That is, we were not bound to the conventions of a Jewish theological seminary or Harvard University. We were free to do whatever we wanted. And Funkenstein really encouraged that. So there was a sense of liberation. And yeah, I think that today people are very much, I mean, there's so many dogmas now that people have to navigate that make it, I think, very different and in many ways more difficult to be a graduate student in the field.
Well, this brings me to a related theme, which is the theme of creativity. And as I read the variety and reread the variety of essays in this book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, it struck me that creativity was a unifying theme. The countercanonical is one unifying theme, but another is the interrogation of the act of inspiration. And not to be too listy, but just to provide those listening who either are still reading or are awaiting the pleasure of reading this book. I think about these essays. I think about the way you write about the biblical figure of Korah's rebellion as a catalyst to the expansion of tradition. You write about Ibn Ezra's drive to fuse biblical and philosophical study. You write about Nachman of Bratslav and depression as a source of inspiration. Krachmal's desire to bridge the gap between traditional thought and secularism. I'm going to keep going. I know the list is long, but the length is part of the point. Leopold von Sacher's unexpected use of pornography to eroticize Jewish tradition. The importance of outsiderism to the towering intellectuals, Jewish intellectuals of the Weimar era, who you have returned to again and again in your writings, Strauss, Rosenzweig, Scholem. So thinking about this lengthy and diverse list, it struck me that you are asking in this book, not only how does Jewish culture exist between heresy, between canon and heresy, but you're also asking why. Why does Jewish culture exist between canon and heresy? So I wonder if you would meditate on that why, and perhaps additionally think with us about what it means, what is to be found in that space between canon and heresy. Obviously, Jewish culture is found there, but what, since we've been speaking so much about California, perhaps we could say what energetically can be found in that space between canon and heresy. What in terms of inspiration and creative spark?
Yeah, well, this is a difficult question. I think that Jewish intellectual history obviously owes a great deal to the Talmud. That is, the Talmudic idea of discourse is highly theoretical in many cases. In other words, the point is not necessarily to arrive at what is the law, although that may be the practical implication, but it's the dialectic, it's the discourse, it's the lack of agreement. There's always somebody out there to attack what seems to be the canonical position, to interrogate it. And I have to believe that this cultural kind of ethos has extended throughout Jewish history. Now, obviously, the study of Talmud, the rabbinic culture was not that of all Jews. Women were excluded. For most of Jewish history, poor men were excluded. They did not partake in this. It's only today that we have, enormous numbers of men studying in numbers that have never been seen in Jewish history. So one has to recognize that whatever the nature of this dialectic, it was limited to a certain intellectual elite. And then with modernity, I think it becomes the, with a great deal of struggle, becomes the patrimony of everyone. So I think that there is a sense of creativity there, of the ability to go against the grain, that is already there. One could even trace it to the Bible to some extent, which is such a heterogeneous text that there are many, it's multivocal, there are many voices, there are many different ideas there. For example, one essay in the book is about the divine name El Shaddai, which I argue means a God with breasts, Shaddai. And this suggests that at least one particular strand of biblical tradition saw God as possibly possessing female characteristics. So this sort of ferment, I think, accompanies the Jews throughout Jewish history and allows for a kind of originality and creativity. Now, of course, because the tradition also has a canon and also has a law that becomes incumbent on everyone, there is a struggle here. It's not simply anarchic. So there's always something to struggle against that is more conventional and shall we say, rigid. But I think that this kind of originality or creativity, as you call it, is something that is not just modern, but has its roots in earlier periods as well.
And would you posit that it is quintessentially Jewish?
Well, I wouldn't try to claim that other cultures don't have this kind of dialectic themselves in their own way. There are certain unique features of this. There is no other book in world literature like the Talmud. It's remarkable and unique in its own way, and it is formative, of course, for Jewish intellectual life. But it doesn't mean that this kind of subterranean traditions that struggle against canonical traditions doesn't exist elsewhere. Carlo Ginzburg, for example, one of your colleagues at UCLA, has, of course, made this argument very powerfully. And so I think that creativity is something that is part of the human condition. We even when we're in a straitjacket of tradition, we struggle to make our own voices heard.
Wonderful, thank you. Let me pause to say that for those who are joining us online, please do feel free to enter questions in the Q&A chat, and I will keep an eye on them. And in a few moments, begin to weave those in. I have more questions than I can possibly make our way through, but I will move through a couple more. Please.
I see that most of the questions have appeared in the chat, and I think you wanted them in the Q&A.
I see. I will try to keep an eye on both portals then. Yes, we will do our best to. And certainly, David, if there's anything that you would like to comment on, you can jump in. I'd like to talk about Gershom Scholem as a source of inspiration for you, because your engagement with Scholem has bookended, near bookended your writing career thus far. Your first book, published in 1979, as you described in your opening, was a biography of Scholem, inspired by your dissertation. This book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, gains a central argument out of inspiration from Scholem's formulation. Why has he become through your writing. Why is his writing so potent, and how has his role as, let's say, muse shifted as your own writing has shifted?
Yeah, so I think Scholem came from a similar kind of milieu, although obviously in a different idiom. He was part of a kind of a countercultural revolt against his parents' bourgeois Judaism. For him, that led to Zionism, but not only Zionism, it also led to the study of these sources. Nobody could teach him how to read Kabbalistic sources. He had to teach himself, taught himself Hebrew. He was part of this, what Michael Brenner has described as the Jewish Renaissance of Weimar Germany. And I think, mutatis mutandi, the counterculture that I emerged from has certain structural similarities to where Scholem came from as well. So there is that point of identification, I think, that I already sensed when I, even before Scholem's 2 autobiographical books came out, there was a very long biographical interview that Muki Tsur did with him. This was very inspirational to me to read that. And also meeting Scholem was very inspirational. It's interesting, I interviewed him for probably about 6 hours total for my dissertation. I actually discovered the notes from that very recently. And I was kind of amazed that for me, what was important in that was not so much the content, but the effect of being with this person and hearing this, and he was, by the way, I mean, he was had a very anarchic spirit. He was also very funny. He was very inspirational to me for all those reasons. The first book that I wrote that came out of this dissertation was only very partially biographical, because most of the sources were not available. He was still alive. So it really was a kind of intellectual history of Scholem as both a historian and as a philosopher of history. There is some biographical stuff on the period of World War I and the 20s. But the more recent book that I wrote for the Jewish Lives series is a biography, and the sources were available through letters and diaries and so forth that were not available earlier. And I was able to draw a much more complete picture of him and to see the interaction between his intellectual work and his personal life. And that was very exciting to see that, this was a person who was not, sort of isolated in an ivory tower. And no, he was very much engaged with his world, and his writing took a lot of inspiration from that engagement. So that was also very inspirational for me. Now, Amos Funkenstein thought that after I wrote my book on Scholem, I would continue doing that kind of intellectual history. And I decided not to. I decided I was going to join the very young field then in Jewish studies of gender and sexuality studies. And I remember I met with Scholem. I interviewed him for the New York Review of Books in 1980. And I said to him, well, you've pioneered this new field of study of Kabbalah. What are the new fields that need to be opened up in Jewish studies? And he said, without a moment hesitation, the history of Jewish criminals. So I said, well, yeah, that's very interesting, and I think that's valuable. I said, I'm actually thinking of the study of gender and sexuality. He looks at me and he says, that's not a field. That's when I knew it was a field. If this great historian, who had broken these barriers, he did so because other people said, what you're doing is not a field. And so that for me was a kind of an invitation to break loose of this purely sort of history of ideas approach, which Funkenstein had taught me, into a more broad kind of cultural studies approach.
Well, there's there's more I'd like to discuss about that, but I also think it's worth amplifying the fact that in your interviews with Scholem, you are dedicating a lot of time, both of you, to thinking about each of your relationships to Israel and the political moment in which you find yourselves in the course of these different conversations. And that is a theme that has informed your work in many ways. And this book concludes with a meditation on your own ambivalent relationship to Israel. So whether you wish to include Scholem in this or leave him aside for a moment, I wonder if you would speak about that, the role of Israel that it has played for you, your generation of scholars, which I think inevitably will lead us to ask, to take a charge that you offer in your book, which is to engage the past and the present. And so it will lead us inevitably to ask about the current moment, the current perilous and potent moment, and how you think about that with the benefit of your scholarly expertise.
Yeah, so I would say that for my generation in Jewish studies, it was considered an essential part of our training to go spend a year or more at one of the Israeli universities, because you could get a kind of a text-oriented approach that I mean, it was available in the United States, but the resources were so much richer there, and we were expected to do that, and I did. But it also meant being exposed to an academic culture that was very different from American culture. And I think that the kind of creativity that I've brought to my work would not have been possible if I had been trained there, because you had to work on a very narrow subject, which you learned, to its depths, whereas this kind of genealogical approach would have been anathema there. So the encounter with Israel academically was terribly important, formative, but also in many ways helped me define how I was different. But I would say that academic experience has to be set in a larger picture, which is the encounter with Israel as a whole in the late 60s and early 70s, a country which had just, won the Six-Day War. There was this sense of elation and, that Israel had, was now asserting its power. But already there were these discordant notes. I went in 1972 on what was called the Tza'adat Yerushalayim, the March to Jerusalem, which took place in the West Bank, and we marched through Palestinian villages, and I suddenly realized, no, this is not going to end well, this occupation. They say it's benign, but it's not, it can't be benign. And so already at that point, I had the sense that, of course, without knowing what the future held, that there was the potential in Israel for things to turn very, very bad. And what we're seeing now, this attempt at a judicial coup, which is very much linked to the occupation. It can't be separated from the occupation. This is, in a way, a kind of, I already had intimations of that back in the early 70s. And it's certainly one reason, not the only reason, of course, but one reason why I did not accept a position in an Israeli university, even though I was offered one. Now, Scholem, already back in the 1920s, he writes a letter to Franz Rosenzweig, famous letter in which he says, and he had been there at that point only for 3 years, he said, "We're living on a volcano here. We have uncovered in the Hebrew language, the sources of apocalypse, which would threaten to devour us." He already had a sense of danger. And when I interviewed him in 1980 for the New York Review of Books, I asked him, well, what do you think? Do you think that the Gush Emunim, the settler movement, that they're like the Sabbateans, that they're apocalyptic? He said, absolutely. That's what they're like, except they're even more dangerous. The case of Sabbateanism, it was a spiritual catastrophe. In the case of what's happening now, now was in 1980, but now is also now 2023, is something that is taking place on the political in the political realm that could have disastrous consequences. And so I think that I think my work has very much been influenced by this relationship to Israel, which I define as ambivalent. I was raised by a socialist Zionist father. We lived in Israel when I was 9 years old. My father wanted to stay, my mother did not, so we returned. But this is very much a part of who I was. It was the best year of my childhood, so I identified with Israel very strongly. So I want to actually read. I see we want to leave time for questions here. I just want to read the last paragraph of
Could you
the
begin?
book.
Actually, I was going to ask you the same, David,
Sure.
but could you begin from the years have involved peregrinations on 238?
Yes, of course, of course. Yeah. So just to fill in the audience, I decided to append a autobiographical essay called "By the Waters of San Francisco." This is an allusion to a popular Israeli song, sitting in San Francisco on the Waters by Arik Einstein. It was actually written in Hebrew for a volume that came out in Hebrew on historians of Israel or related to Israel, writing their kind of intellectual autobiography. So it's a translation of that. I mean, I wrote it in English, but it appeared first in Hebrew. So let me read this. The years have involved peregrinations from California to upstate New York to Israel and back to California by the waters of San Francisco, where we have now lived happily for the past 3.5 decades. Unlike Scholem's, my course did not bring me ultimately to Zion, but rather to a very different life in a diaspora he could never have imagined in the Berlin of the early 20th century. But his biography, which is the last book I have written, thus closing the circle with my first book, continues to speak to me as well as I try to integrate the various sides of my own life as an historian, a secular Jew, and an American born in the middle of the 20th century. My father's secular Zionism, much of which I inherited, now appears like a naive and utopian belief, which is founded on the shores of rampant capitalism, ultra-Orthodoxy, and ethno-nationalism. But I am still unwilling to relinquish the shards of that belief. I find myself at times in a lonely position as a secular Jew at home in both Israel and the United States, but also at home in neither. And so it is that the dialectics between the state of Israel and the diaspora, between a Jewish and an American identity, and between religion and secularism continue to inform my life and work as they have since the beginning.
Thank you.
It's a good place to stop.
I'd like to weave in some comments and questions from the Q&A. I welcome anyone to add more. I've been also monitoring the chat, but I think most of the questions have made their way to the Q&A. There is an interesting question that I think is relevant to the passage that you just read from Yevhen Minko, inspired by your book, Blood and Belief. And he asks, do you think that the blood libel myth will continue to mutate into new and unexpected forms nowadays or in the future? So I gather he is inviting you to extend that genealogy forward.
Well, to quote Scholem, I'm a professor and not a prophet. So I have no idea, but I mean, what's fascinating about this folkloric myth is that it doesn't seem to go away. It is part of a kind of tradition, folkloric tradition that's actually rooted in a much wider field of ideas about blood, which this is what I discovered in writing this. You can't separate the blood libel from mythic ideas about blood that it may have nothing at all to do with Jews. So yes, I assume it will continue in some form or another. It does circulate even now, particularly in the Arab world, I regret to say, but yes, it probably will continue.
Thank you. Michelle Quintner writes that they recall how rich it was to study with you, David, in the early 1980s, and invites you to comment on, if you wish, the creativity and style of Talmudic tradition versus Midrashic tradition. There's also a somewhat disparate, but I think related question about Hasidism, which is a leap, of course, but to ask you to compare, to consider whether this is this tradition is considered a heretical one against rabbinic Judaism. So 2 questions inviting you to reflect on different Jewish approaches and styles and moments.
Well, it's kind of wonderful to have a student from my days at Binghamton, where I got my start here on this webinar. Yeah, maybe I'll approach this question a little bit differently in terms of pedagogy. So my approach has always been to try to excite students with the intellectual challenge that is the Jewish tradition. In other words, as opposed to a kind of, introduction to Judaism approach where, we learn about the Shabbat and we learn about, the calendar and, kashrut and so on. That's not the approach. The approach has to be to find in this tradition ideas that are intellectually really exciting, and that can, make students want to learn more. I want to quote, I gave a course for a number of years at Davis on secular Jewish thinkers, which eventually became my book, Not in the Heavens, the Tradition of Jewish Secular Thought. And Spinoza plays, of course, a very central role in that book. And I still remember a student who of Yemeni background, so very far from anything Jewish. He never heard about these things. He took the class, and after we did a session on Spinoza, he came up to me and he said, "You just blew my mind." I said, "No, I've succeeded now. That is, I've given him some idea that was completely foreign, but expanded what one thought, not just about Judaism, but about the world in general." And that's been my sort of pedagogical challenge all the way through, is to be able to teach in that way. And the same is true when teaching rabbinic sources, to discover the marvelous sort of richness and moments of contention. These are the words of the living God. With regard to Hasidism, I would say that Hasidism never was a heretical movement, despite the efforts of its opponents to paint it that way. It was very much within the so to say Orthodox tradition, or the traditional Judaism of Eastern Europe. What it innovated was primarily on the social level, that is, creating a new idea of community and leadership that had never existed before in Jewish history. And that, that's something that is remarkably creative in the movement. There are also many ideas there that are, because of this communal structure where the tzaddik or the rebbe, had to be the mediator between God and his followers, the Hasidim. We find, extraordinary ideas, but they are never really heretical, I would say. Or if they are heretical because the tradition itself holds the potential for such ideas.
That also seems to take us back to a central point of your book, that space between canon and heresy, precisely because it is a creative one, actually erodes the boundaries around each, suggesting that neither is distinct or distinctive.
Yes,
meaning the boundaries
God.
between canon and heresy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, because thank God the Jews have never had a Vatican or a Council of Nicaea. We don't have a dogma. And in the Middle Ages, of course, there were a variety of thinkers, starting with Maimonides, who tried to develop, what are the essential principles of Judaism. But even they did not pretend that this was a dogma in the Catholic sense of the word. So the idea of canon, which really is, in a certain sense, foreign to Judaism, has porous boundaries in the Jewish context. And similarly, heretics, and I have several essays dealing with historical heresies, and the way in which modern Jewish thinkers have thought about those heretics. Those heretics are always somehow never totally excluded from the tradition. They are, like in the case of Acher or Elisha ben Abuya, they are rabbinized. They're brought back into the tradition. You learn from their Torah, even if you don't follow their practice. And so heresy also has a very, very different meaning in the Jewish context than it does in the Christian context. These are two ideas that are, I guess, and maybe I should have reflected more on this in the book, two ideas that are really being imported from elsewhere into Judaism.
Interesting. I'm so pleased that in your earlier answer, you talked about the classroom. David, you have won the highest award from UC Davis, which is the Prize for Undergraduate Teaching and Scholarly Achievement. I know you have been a dedicated teacher, much loved by your students. And I also felt in reading this book, Jewish Culture Between Canon and Heresy, that notwithstanding its erudition, notwithstanding its range and its depth, it was also written in a way that one could imagine you delivering these essays as lectures. They are narratively framed as only the most clear and persuasive teacher could frame them. So I wonder if you have thoughts about how the teaching, your dedication to teaching, has shaped perhaps your writing or your scholarship, and those might be two different domains to dwell on.
Yeah, I would say that in all my writing, I've tried to be accessible to a non-specialist audience, because the questions that that interested me, I thought should be of interest to people who are not necessarily specialists in the field. And so I've always tried to write in that way that is accessible. And I think that, of course, is related to teaching. So, I've had some wonderful experiences teaching the book Cultures of the Jews. So these are essays written by scholars on different cultural formations, starting with the Bible and going forward. And they are not, in a certain sense, written as an introductory text, but I've used it as an introductory text because one of the things that I tried to do together with my wonderful editors, Arthur Samuelson, and then later Susan Ralston, was to make the writing totally accessible. So I actually rewrote a number of the essays myself so that they would be accessible. And so I've used that in teaching undergraduates in a course called Introduction to Jewish Cultures. It's the first time they may have encountered Judaism and Jewish history. And I assign them these chapters and have them write reading summaries. And I've been astonished at how the undergraduate students, we bemoan their inability to read and so forth. But no, they were able to understand the main arguments of the chapters and to bring them to bear in their writing. So yes, there is a kind of interaction for sure between my writing and my teaching. I want to make my writing as accessible as possible to undergraduates as to a general audience.
Thank you. Well, we are woefully out of time, and I see there are a number of questions that came in just as the bell was ringing in my ear. So I apologize that I was not able to address all of those questions offered here. But David, I would say, by way of conclusion, not only congratulations for this wonderful book, and not only thank you for being such a wonderful colleague and friend and intellectual inspiration, but also that I will spend the next day and night and time forward thinking about which books to tell you not to write, because I can see that the best way to get you to delve into future engagements is to tell you that there's nothing there. So we thank you for your relentlessness, your creativity, your productivity, and your generosity as a scholar, as a writer, as a teacher. Wonderful to be in conversation with you. YIVO, we thank you for this opportunity. And I know that David's book is available through the YIVO store with a link attached to this webinar, and I suppose the other platforms in which this event will be launched.
Thank you, Sarah. And I can't imagine anybody better to be in conversation with about my book. You've been the most wonderful colleague over the years, and hopefully for many more years in the future.
Amen. Thank you, David.